Okay, welcome. So today I wanted to follow on from my podcast from last week with Wyndham Wallace talking about cults. And today I wanted to just go into a bit more depth about what is a cult and then the 6 sociological characteristics of a cult. And then I want to talk about how that might link into boarding schools from biographies I've read and my own experiences. So, a bit of an exploration today. So I was doing some research for today, and I was really drawn last week when my podcast went live with Wyndham Wallace, which, if you've not seen it yet, it's a great episode. I'll put it into the description. He's talking about how boarding schools are like branches of a cult. And so I was just doing some research, and I was looking at Stephen Hassan, who's one of the US's leading experts on cults, and he's written quite a few books. And then there's another man called Andy Naselli, who's a professor at I think the Bethlehem University. So what is a cult? These are Stephen Hassan's words. Destructive individuals and cults use deception and undue influence to make people dependent and obedient. It is typically authoritarian, headed by a person or a group of people with near complete control of followers. Cult influence is designed to disrupt a person's authentic identity and replace it with a new identity. Now, as I read through that, I'm like, wow, that just sounds like boarding school, It says destructive individuals and cults use deception, undue influence to make people dependent and obedient. So, for me, if we look at the deception side of things, I think the advertising that I saw and received as a child, Alex Renton talks about that as well, the Mallory Towers, these children's stories saying what a amazing place they are, and we get sold on the external values of the boarding school. But really the deception is it's not a loving place. Our parents aren't there. We don't understand. So I feel that boarding schools use deception to get students in to the schools. People might disagree. That's fine. This is just my own personal experience. An undue influence to make people dependent and obedient. So, we are dependent. We've talked about this quite a bit on the podcast about the attachment. We are attached to our parents. We go to boarding school, we break that attachment, and we become dependent on the school. So, in the same way that people in a cult are becoming dependent on the cult, we're becoming dependent on the institution. And that's why, we'll come on to that later, very few people speak up about their experiences at boarding schools. Generally, now that it's starting to gather momentum, but it's only really Nick Duffell since the 90s where people are starting to speak up, and now it's turning into, oh my God, people are really coming forward. And obedient, if you weren't obedient in these schools, what happened? Well, you were punished. I heard of a girl who was smoking and she kept getting caught, and they kept doubling her fine until towards the end she had a fine. This is in 1990, 91, a fine for £900. £900, which, this is ridiculous. So you have these rules that you've got to be obedient. If you're not, eventually you get expelled. A group should not be considered. It is typically authoritarian. So, a boarding school is authoritarian. The headmaster or the heads of the houses, they have ultimate charge. In my boarding school, one of the teachers who was eventually arrested for sexual abuse, he said the teachers were like gods. That's that authoritarian. They are some amazing figure. Headed by a person or group of people with near complete control of the followers. Yes, that is what a boarding school is. The teachers, the senior leaders within the school, they have complete control. over, the students. The cult influence is designed to disrupt a person's authentic identity. So Nick Duffell talks about that we have to survive these institutions. We have to create a strategic survival personality, whether that is complier, whether that's rebel, whether that's crushed. We have to put a mask on. We have to hide our authentic identity, who we are. We have to become like everybody else. We have to put on a uniform, a bit like a prison. We have to eat at the same time. We lose that spontaneity that a child has, and we replace it with a new identity. And the new identity is, right, I am now a member of this institution, cult. Cult leaders want people who will be obedient to them and their rules. I've already talked about that. There are so many rules in these schools, so many rules. Everyone in the biographies I have say, oh, there was this rule, that rule, and Nick Duffell talks about that quite a lot. They look for ways to break people. Again, what happens in these boarding school? You go to boarding school, you're securely attached in most cases, but then you break that attachment. Another thing which Andy Naselli says is, he says the social characteristics, there's 6 of them. The third one is isolationism. So you're isolating yourself away from society. It's Jeremy Paxman in here. I mentioned this last week. He says they were isolated, totally cut off from society. Same as my school. When I spoke to Gabor Mate, he says, could you run away? I said, no, in the middle of nowhere. So, he says the more extreme cults sometimes create fortified boundaries. We didn't need to, when I went back to my school recently, it was impossible to get in without permission unless it was on a, what was it? On an old boys' day, old girls' day. And the other thing which was interesting, the isolationism, when I went into my old boarding house, they now have a key lock that you can't get in and out. So that isolationism, unless specific times. If you've got lesson time, you can get out of the house. But what else in here? They want people who work hard and long hours, and they talk about in a cult, for adults, little or no pay. But I think the work hard, that's the expectation. Nick Duffell, the timetabling, you've got to work hard. You've got a timetable from 7 o'clock in the morning for me when I got to boarding school till 9:30 at night. You're always timetabled. So long hours, really long hours. And then for us, you never go home. It's 7 days a week, which is just like a cult. They want willing slaves. Cult psychology. Authoritarian religious cults often use members for labor trafficking. That doesn't relate to that. When the mind is controlled, a victim may appear happy and willing to suffer for the profit or benefit of the leader group. And many people say, oh, they've settled in. No, what's happened is their attachment has been broken. They've realized, and when I was speaking to a leading author about neglect, he said that, neglect is often the child just gives up and they're not noticed. We call that settling in Britain. Oh, they've settled into boarding school. No, their attachment's been broken. They've given up. They've gone into that neglect state. So it's very, very different. They appear happy. For members, happiness comes from good performance within the group, along with elitist thinking, believing they have the truth or the best way of life. So, what do these schools promote? Elitist thinking. We're the best. I remember when I left boarding school and I met people who had been to my local comprehensive, and they were telling me they went to university, and I was really shocked. I'm like, I really believe that anyone who went to a comprehensive, is what I've been told in my boarding school, they wouldn't be able to go to university because they were stupid. It was like, really, this elitist sense that I'd picked up there. They are manipulated by fear and guilt, and they may be stuck. I certainly felt stuck. The only way I felt I could get out was either suicide or being expelled, and I knew that that wasn't an option because I knew my father would be really angry with me. So, I mean, this is a deep subject, and I won't go into that much more depth. I'll just read out Andy Naselli's sociological characteristics of cult. He says authoritarian leadership, yes, definitely a boarding school has that. Exclusivism, yes, definitely. It's only people who can afford or from a certain social class can go. It says here, cults often believe they alone have the truth. Yeah, this is the only way to have a proper education. So it's exclusive. Isolationism, already mentioned that. Opposition to independent thinking. Yeah, we weren't allowed to think outside the box. That there was something wrong with this. You weren't allowed to speak up. There was rife abuse in my school. You weren't allowed to talk about it. No, that you didn't grass up. So some cultic groups discourage members from thinking independently. The thinking, as it were, has already been done for them by the cult leadership. No, this is the way you're doing it. Fear of being disfellowshipped, basically meaning of being rejected. So that's why people don't, speak up. I've been reading this book here, which is fascinating. Oliver Butler to the World, talking about the financial sector in London, saying so many of people working in the city, certainly in the 50s and 60s, 70s, were Eton primarily, then Harrow, and then Winchester a little bit. But it was primarily, the old public school network. Again, the cult. So you have to stay in that network, even after you leave the school. And then he says here, threats of satanic attack, Andy Naselli. What he's meaning here is, finally, some cults use fear and intimidation to keep members in line. And yeah, that's the same for these institutions. Is if you step out of line, you speak up, you're not going to be part of the old boys network. You're not going to get the funding, etc., etc. So as I do this research, I'm shocked. Yeah, in my opinion, according to these, boarding schools are cults. And it's shocking. Behavior modification techniques are employed. I mean, yeah, wow, it's incredible. So, yes, that is that. Please, if you've got any questions, whether you agree, you don't agree, you're like, oh wow, that's pretty incredible. Do some research. Do buy Stephen Hassan's books about cults, and you realise, oh wow, yeah, it's actually very similar. This Friday, I've got an interview going live with Giles Moffat, who is one of the leading campaigners for the abuse going on in Scotland, and that's now spreading to the rest of the UK, and actually taking these schools to court. And he talks about, well, what can we do if we want to take a school to court for abuse, whatever. And he's amazing. And if you've not seen Wyndham Wallace's podcast yet, please do watch it. So this weekend I'm going to be going off to the Boarding School Survivor Support Conference down in London. I know there's quite a lot of friends, colleagues who are going to be there. So if you're there, please do come and say hello. And bless you. And take care. Bye for now.